Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Ashwin, and welcome back to the fourth session on how to build your own Clubhouse. Clubhouse is a social audio app where you can discover rooms and participate in conversations in those rooms using your voice. Okay, now, I work as a software developer at Egen Solutions, and today I'm going to be teaching you how to use Node.js to talk to your database, extract data, and build a RESTful web service that returns the data in order to provide it to a user interface. Okay, and we have Dan who's joined us again. So for today's session, you will be using the boilerplate repository that I may have showed you in the previous sessions. The boilerplate is over here, and if you haven't done it already, please watch the earlier sessions and clone the repository and install it in your system. Okay, now here's the agenda for today. This is session 4. So what we're going to do is we'll have a quick session recap of what we covered previously, and then we're going to also go through the exercise from session 3. Fine. After that, I'm just going to walk you through what is Node.js and what is Express. We'll also talk a little bit about the directory structure that is over here. And finally, we'll just sort of examine what happens when you go to a website. Okay. Once we've done all that, we are ready to begin building our RESTful web service. So for all the queries that we wrote earlier, extracting all available rooms and fetching all available rooms for a single user, we're going to build a web service that utilizes those queries and serves them as a RESTful API. Okay. And then finally, we'll have a discussion on what does an API even mean. I guess all of us know that it stands for Application Programming Interface, but an API can mean a lot of different things in different contexts. So we'll just have a quick discussion on what does it mean. Cool. So I'm going to open up my code, and this is the same boilerplate repository that I've already cloned and installed on my system. This is Visual Studio Code, which is a text editor. It's a lot more than just a text editor. It has a lot of plugins for helping you code easily, right? So if you notice on the left, it shows me all the directories and all the files in my project. Okay. Now, I'm going to walk you through what some of those files are and why are they being used. Okay. So first thing is, if you notice, we have this, hope you can see it clearly. We have this folder called models. Okay. Here is where I keep all my files that are related to database operations, such as the ones that we wrote in the previous sections. Okay, so if I'm creating functions to store something to a table or to retrieve something from a table, so those functions are going to be written in these files, one of those files over here in this directory. Okay. Now, I also have something called routes. Okay, here is where you will define your REST API endpoints. Okay, and you can as well have more than a single file inside this folder, one for each different type of feature. So I have a routes file for the rooms feature, and I have a main index.js file that is more like, when you go to a home page and you want some information that typically is not just limited to a room, but it might be, let's say, belong to the entire application. So I can split my routes into different files and save it, and that way it helps me to organize my code better. Cool. And I also have this folder called public. Here is where I keep all the files that are actually available to the public. Okay, stuff like style sheets over here. This is where you write your CSS, and your client-side JavaScript is also over here in a folder called modules. And you might also have images that you want to show to your users, right? Things like a logo, perhaps, or maybe some icons. So those would go under the images folder. It's not necessary that it has to be the same name that I'm using over here, but having meaningful names makes it easier for you to understand where each file will go. What folder contains what kind of information or what kind of files, right? And I also have this another folder called views. Here is where I'm going to keep my HTML templates. So that's going to look like this. Okay, I'm going to tell you later on what this extension .hbs stands for. But for now, just remember that here is where you keep your HTML files. Templates are, the first request to a website usually serves one of these files over here when you go to a website, okay? And that's all you need to know for now. And then there are other files. This is a JS config file, and that actually enables VS Code to show you if you made any errors in your code. Okay, so I've enabled this thing called check.js to true, and that's going to point me out in case I make any mistakes in my code. It's very useful. But if you feel like it can come in between when you code, sometimes it can get a bit annoying, so you can just turn it off, but I prefer to keep it on. And there are other kinds of files. Package.json. Now this file is a special file that's there within every Node repository, any Node.js project, okay? And it's going to contain the name of the project, the version, and it's going to contain some additional keys over here, one of them being scripts. And here you can define when you write a command, let's say npm start, that command should basically run a file. So you can define what file to run over here on the issuing of a certain command. And then most importantly though, it has all the project dependencies listed over here. And most of these project dependencies usually are in the Node ecosystem. So when you go to npm, you'll see there it's basically a repository, right? You can search for a lot of packages over here. It's a repository that has a lot of different packages for different purposes. Most popular web frameworks like React, Express.js, jQuery, etc. are available in the npm ecosystem. So this shows you what packages are being used in your project, okay? Cool. With that, we can move ahead. What I want to show you is next, what happens when we go to a website, okay? So that's going to help us understand this concept of REST APIs a bit better, okay? So let's say I'm going to twitter.com, okay? And this is my profile on Twitter, and I'm seeing a bunch of feeds over here, a lot of tweets. So if I want to analyze what requests does this page send, what I can do is I can just do a right click and do inspect, and that's gonna open the Google Chrome's developer console, okay? And there are a bunch of tabs over here. Now, what I'm interested in this is the network tab, because this is going to show me all the network requests that this page makes, right? Most of them are going to be requests to Twitter's web servers, and sometimes it may be to other web services, okay? Let me just do a quick hard refresh. I'm gonna hold here and I'm gonna just say empty cache and hard reload, okay? Now what happens here? Let's see. So the default view when you go open the network tab is going to show you every kind of request. That includes requests that are API endpoints, and it's also going to be requests that are typically used for fetching files, okay? So it's going to be in the all tab. But what I'm interested is in the fetch/xhr, okay? These are typically the ones that constitute REST APIs, okay? I can also look at requests that specifically fetch JavaScript files. I can also filter for requests that specifically fetch style sheets, and likewise images, media, fonts, and so on. Let's see what's the first request that this website sends, okay? So I'm gonna go back to the all tab, and if you notice right on the top, we have the home. It's sending a request to twitter.com/home, okay? Now when I click this, you can see that there are various details that are presented to you in this request. General details, then response headers, and then request headers, okay? And usually the first request when you go to twitter.com/home is going to be an HTML page. It's going to be a template of sorts, okay? So if you notice the preview shows you what the request actually returned, okay? So this is an HTML document, okay? And if you want to see the raw document, you can go here to the next tab. It's called response, and that actually shows you the entire HTML code that you see. So usually that's the first request. Now you might wonder, well, it's showing JavaScript is not available. It's showing some HTML that's not what we're seeing over here. That's because this is just the default template that Twitter sends to your browser. But then, you know, you also have client-side JavaScript, right? So what's the client-side JavaScript going to do is it's going to check if your browser has JavaScript enabled, and if it does, then it's going to send additional requests that replace this content over here. It's going to replace this content with the content that you see over here, right? That's what happens. And suppose if you have disabled your JavaScript, then it's not going to be able to display anything else, right? Because it's not going to be able to issue any other requests. So you'll see JavaScript is not available if you happen to disable JavaScript in your browser. Cool. So that's usually the first request. And then you also have some subsequent requests for fetching JavaScript files. That's why you see .js over here. This is a JavaScript file. But we are mainly interested in this part, which is the fetch requests. The reason is because we are going to write a RESTful API of our own, okay? So there are two most common kinds of requests that a client can make. One is a GET request, and that's usually used for just retrieving information, okay? The other kind of request is something called as a POST request. Now, POST request is typically used to save information. So if I were to go here and create a new tweet and hit enter, that's actually going to send the data, right? So if I go here I clicked on tweet and I type something here, hello world, right? And if I click on tweet, it's going to send this information, what I typed, as a post request to the server, and then the server can store it in the database. Okay, I'm just going to discard this. This is an example of a GET request. How do I know that? Because there's information about the request over here, request method GET, and there's also something called as a status code that indicates if the request was successful or whether it threw an error. So HTTP status codes are usually used to indicate if a request was successful, or if it threw an error, then what was the error about? Why didn't the request succeed? Okay, 200 usually means that it's successful. Okay, and the preview, as you can see, is actually a JavaScript object which contains some keys over here, right? So this is a request that returned the data back in the form of JSON. Okay, so if I select this, okay, I'm just going to copy this request and I'm going to open it in a new tab. Yeah, so if you notice, what happened is, usually a lot of these websites have security mechanisms, okay, in the sense that the only way that this request can be sent ever is from twitter.com itself. Okay, if you try to copy the request and paste it somewhere else in a browser, or maybe I use my terminal to issue a curl command, it's gonna block my request. Okay, that's why it says access to twitter.com was denied. I don't have authorization to view this page. That's because it doesn't allow me to use this API, because this API is meant to be used only by the Twitter's home page. Okay, so that's one of the many security features that web application engineers, typically backend guys, need to think about. Okay, but often you might see sometimes that you can indeed copy it and paste it and it will actually show you the JSON response. However, it's very unlikely that you'll find on sites like Twitter though. Okay, so that was about RESTful APIs. And once the API is returned and the client has the data, then the client can use this data to display this information in the browser, right? That's how it works. So this is what we covered so far in the previous sessions, okay? We wrote a Postgres query that returned us information for all the available rooms for the Clubhouse application. The home page typically has all these information of various rooms in the form of cards. So we wrote a query to retrieve this information from the Postgres database. And now that we have it, we can actually start building a RESTful web service. We can use those APIs that we can use the queries that we wrote earlier to build an API. Okay. So once we write an API, our request is also going to be in the form of JSON. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. Okay, so this is the format usually, and as you can see, each field in my JSON is being mapped onto each field in the UI, right? So, and we've already fetched most of this information. In fact, all of the information we've already fetched so far in the queries that we wrote earlier, but we still have to, serve them to the client. Okay. All right, so I want to just talk a little bit about what is Node.js. Node.js is a JavaScript runtime built on Chrome's V8 JavaScript engine. Okay, typically for a really long time, JavaScript was a programming language that was only possible to run in a browser. But at some point, somebody decided, hey, it's really convenient if we could also make it run outside of a browser. And that is how Node.js was born. So it's the exact same JavaScript engine inside the Chrome browser, but now that is ported out, and now that runtime can be installed in any other system as well. So that will allow you to write JavaScript, to use JavaScript to write a lot of programs, not just a web server. However, Node.js is usually used to build a web server. Okay. Now, it is also designed to build scalable web applications. Okay, almost no function in Node.js directly performs input-output operations. Okay, so the process in Node.js, it never blocks. Okay, because it never blocks, scalable systems are very reasonable to develop in Node.js because everything is asynchronous. Okay. Now, there is this other framework called Express. Okay. Express is a web framework for Node.js that's similar, like, you could use plain JavaScript to build a user interface, right? Or you could as well use React or Angular. In the same way, you can also write and build a web service using just Node.js. However, if you use a web framework like Express, that has a lot of advantages. Okay. Now, I want to show you an example of how a program could look like using just Node.js and what it could look like using Express. Okay. So here, if you can see, on the left-hand side, this is an example of a program of a web server that is written using just Node.js. Okay, so I have a few modules imported. These are from the standard Node.js libraries, HTTP module, and then I create an instance using the HTTP module using http.createServer, and that accepts a callback function to which it passes two objects. Okay, one is a request object, the other is a response object. Okay, so when you noticed in the Twitter page, there was request headers and there were response headers. Okay, so those information would come over here. So if you send something in your request, you will be able to access it using the request object. Now, if you notice in the Node.js program, if you want to create multiple endpoints, so this endpoint /rooms is one such example of an endpoint, an API endpoint. If you want to create multiple such endpoints, usually you will have to separate them using an if-else statement. Okay, so I have a if condition over here that actually parses any request that comes to the server and sees whether the path of the request has /rooms. Okay, and then I have some application logic over here. So here I've defined some dummy values. Okay, a JavaScript object that has a rooms key with some bunch of it's an array of objects over here, and I'm just sending it back as a response. Okay, so here if you notice res.end, where I stringify this data and then I send this data back as a response. So if somebody makes a request, if a client makes a request to /rooms to this particular server, they are going to get back this data in the response. Okay. Now this was just using plain Node.js. What happens if you use Express? You again import Express first, and then you create an application instance using the Express function. Okay. Now this app object is going to give you a bunch of methods. Okay. This first method that you see over here, it says app.get. Okay. To which I pass a string called /rooms, and this structure is pretty much similar. What this means is, if I'm using Express, I can simply write app.get /rooms instead of writing a verbose if-else condition. Okay. So as you can see, this part of the code stays the same, except for this one. I just have to write a single line saying response.json, to which I pass data. And what this will do is it's going to send back this information to the client. So you can use just node.js or you can use Express, but as you can see that if you use Express, it's a lot more neater, right? If you're just using vanilla node.js, it's going to be a lot more verbose. So you'll have to write a lot of things manually yourself. You have to set the headers yourself, and you will have to stringify this data, this object. Okay. And not to mention, you have to keep using the if-else condition yourself to check every single time if one such request has a path value of rooms. Whereas over here, I can just simply write app.get /rooms, so that any request sent by a client to the path /rooms, it's going to immediately come over here. So that's one such huge advantage of using Express. So, Express is being used in several companies. So if you notice over here, this is the Stack Overflow survey results from 2020. If you notice, Express is one very popular web framework that is used by most software developers. Right? On the top is jQuery, but then if you notice, the top three are client-side frameworks. ASP.NET is I have not worked in ASP.NET, but I think it's a backend framework. But right after that, you see Express. So it's that widely used across many, many companies. Okay. And not to mention, it's also one of the projects that are supported by the OpenJS Foundation. Okay. So OpenJS Foundation has a lot of popular, critical open source JavaScript projects. These are projects typically that they would prefer to be maintained for a really long time. Okay. So if you notice over here, you're going to find Express over here, right? This is a foundation project. And you can see there are a lot of foundation members that support these projects in their development and also their maintenance. So you can see that, Google, Coinbase, GitHub, Netflix, Giant, Microsoft, these are some of the many companies that back this OpenJS Foundation. So you can rest assured that, Express is something that's going to be fairly maintainable, and, more features are being developed constantly. I think they're also coming up with a version 5. The last time I checked, I think they're standing somewhere in version 4. Yeah, Express 5 is in alpha documentation right now. Okay, so now that we have seen what is Express, we are ready to begin developing our application. So I'm going to open up my text editor and let's begin. Okay, so my first goal is I don't want to bog you down with too many details. So I'm just going to show you first how to build this just by a quick example. And then I'm going to walk you through the directory structure. Why is it that we chose this particular directory structure over anything else? Because that's really crucial to understand when you write scalable applications, okay? But first, I want to just quickly demonstrate how you can write an API using Express, okay? So if you notice, these are the queries that we wrote last time, okay? This query over here, this fetches all the information of all the available rooms in our Postgres database, okay? Now, if you remember, I said that we write most of our API endpoints, we define them in this directory, okay? So let's open rooms.js. Okay, so here you can see that I already have written some boilerplate code for you, and that is for you to help you get started. Okay, now let's say if I define some dummy values for these rooms. Okay, so I'm gonna say I'm gonna make sure this is an object, let's say. So, and I'm just gonna give some dummy values for now, okay? ID is 1, room name is Clubhouse clone. I'm just giving some dummy values, okay? Club name, okay? And just gonna copy paste this. Okay. Yeah, just some dummy values. Okay, so what this code says is, if any request comes to this part, which is actually /rooms, the reason why I don't have /rooms over here is because in Express, I can define my endpoints in multiple files, okay? And then I can include them over here. So here, if you notice, I imported the file that you just saw, rooms router, and then here I define the endpoint, okay? So a request to /rooms is going to use the rooms router. The rooms router is basically this router which I've just exported in my Express program, okay? And so any GET request to /rooms, this stands for whatever I've given over here, /rooms. Any GET request to this endpoint is gonna, my program is gonna define, an array of objects, and we're just sending it back. That's all we're doing. Okay, so I'm gonna go to my terminal, and in order to first run this program, I need to install all my packages. So I'm gonna run npm install. Okay, so npm install will install all the packages, all my project dependencies from this file, and it's going to create this directory which says node_modules. Okay, then if you notice, I've mentioned instructions on how to run this app over here. run npm start to start the app server. Okay, so I'm going to run npm start. Okay, now if I go to localhost 3000, oh, by the way, my server is running on port 3000. Okay, if you want to know what port your server is running in, you can go to this directory which says bin. It has a file called www. You can go here and you'll notice that we have a port that's defined over here which says 3000. If you haven't defined your own port, then the default port that's going to be used is 3000. Okay, so I'm going to go to localhost 3000. I'm going to type /rooms, and this is what I get. These are the dummy values that we just saw earlier, right? And you can see that it's in the form of JSON. Okay, pretty simple, right? Now, obviously, we don't want to return this dummy value. We actually want to fetch the values from the database. Okay, so how do we do that? So if you want your Node program to speak to your database, there are a lot of database drivers for the specific language or the specific framework that you are using. So one such database middleware is this package called PG over here. Okay, this is a Postgres client for Node.js framework. Okay, and similarly, you will find a lot of other databases that have similarly other clients for many different languages. So Postgres, when we wrote our queries, we wrote it on our PSQL interface, right? But if you are working in a specific language or a specific framework, maybe you're working with C# or .NET or Python, all these popular databases, they need to have their, a client-side package, right? In order to be able to be used in several other languages, okay? So for the Node.js environment, Postgres provides this package which says PG over here, PG package. And you will find there are several other packages as well. Node Postgres is probably the most popular one. Okay, so you can just do an npm install PG, but in our case, we've already installed it using package.json. Okay, now these packages, they actually provide you with a set of methods, a set of functions, and you can use those functions to actually write queries and talk to your database. Okay, so I was over here, right? What I want to do right now is I want to, fetch my information not from here, but I want to fetch it from my Postgres database. So here's what I'm going to do. Right, so if you notice in this directory that says models, there is this file called index.js, and here we have this function called get rooms, okay? And we can use this function to actually write our Postgres query, okay? So here's what we are going to do. We'll go over here and I'm going to copy this query that we wrote last time. Then over here, yeah. So here I'm gonna write this query. So I'm gonna say const text equals, and you can give any variable name that you want, and I'm gonna paste this. Okay. So I've pasted my query that I wrote the last time, just giving it a little bit of indent. Okay. Then I'm going to say const values. So if you notice, our function takes in a parameter called limit. Okay. Now I want to apply my limit over here because I don't want to fetch all the available rooms. Okay, I want to apply a certain limit. Okay, because there might be thousands of rooms. Okay, so it's nice to tell our program how many rooms to actually fetch instead of fetching all the available rooms. So what I can do is I can give the limit over here, and I can tell in my query that I want to apply this parameter, the first parameter in the values array. That's what it means to say $1. $1 would indicate that when you this is a variable that needs to be substituted with the first value in this array. Okay. And then I'm gonna give this command to my PostgreSQL. So I'm gonna say db.query followed by, so db.query is going to take in two commands. Okay, one is text, the other is the values array. Okay, once I do that, I can, instead of returning an empty array, I'm going to return res.rows. Okay. So what this means is when I issue a command to db.query, this is going to use the node, the PG package, and it's going to tell it, please run this query. Okay. And depending on your query, it can return an array of rows, or it can throw an error, which is why we wrote the entire code over here inside a try catch block. So if at any time our query throws an error, it's going to come here and we will handle the error by just printing it out. Okay. So this is what you need to do. You have to always handle any potential exceptions or errors that may arise in your node program. So usually it's recommended to write your code inside a try catch block. Okay. Now I've written this over here. So get rooms, our function is ready. Now we can use this function inside here, inside our routes. Okay. So if you notice, I've already imported the function here from models. Okay. This file has already been imported over here. So now we just need to call the function within this file. Okay. One more extra tip, whenever you want to use a function from one file inside another file, you always need to export it. So if you scroll to the bottom, you see that we've we always export our functions because we want to use these functions in other parts of our application. Okay, so I write module.exports, and then I just write the name of the functions that actually exposes these functions in order to be used in other files as well. Okay, so I've imported the file now. Now I can do, instead of writing this, I can simply write const rooms equals await db dot. Now if you notice, my VS Code actually has an IntelliSense. It actually shows me what are the functions available in that file. Okay, so that's why I use an IDE. That gives me a lot of advantage. So I'm gonna say get rooms, and to get rooms, I'm just gonna pass this limit. Okay, so I'm gonna pass 100 for now. 100 seems fine, right? Okay, now let's see what happens if we run this code. So I'm going to go to my server and I'll restart it. I'm gonna go to my browser and hit refresh. It's also again going to issue a request, a get request to /rooms. And now you can see that we have a single object called rooms, which is actually an array of JSON. Okay, an array of objects. So you can see all these values. Our node program actually asked our database to return a list of all available rooms, right? Yeah. So this is how you write. This is a GET request. It's an example of a GET request because we just want to retrieve information. We're not trying to save anything. If we wanted to save any request, any data, then we'll use a post request. Okay. Now, I think this is sufficient for today, but I want to quickly just talk a little bit about what does it mean to say that something is an API. Okay, the full form of an API is Application Programming Interface. But depending on what you're doing, the meaning of the word API could change in several different contexts. Okay, so for example, an API could just mean a function, right? You know, if you're, let's say, using React.js, the library has a lot of APIs. Okay. Similarly, if you're using some other web framework like jQuery, that also has a lot of APIs. So an API is just an abstraction, okay? But depending on whom you're having this conversation with, the meaning could change slightly, okay? So when you're talking with a backend developer, you're usually referring to this endpoint that we just wrote, okay? But if you are, let's say, talking to the maintainer of React.js and they use this word API, so that could mean something else. But in the broadest sense, an API is just an abstraction layer, okay? So one program or one module talking with another module, okay? So when one program A wants to talk with another program B, okay, program A wants to use the services of program B. In that case, the program B is going to expose or provide a set of APIs, okay? So that's how the program A is going to talk with program B. It's going to use the services by using these APIs provided by the program B, okay? And that allows for a very neat separation across different parts of your application, okay? That's why, because in computer engineering, when program A wants to talk with program B, program A should never try to infer how program B does its job, okay? It never should do that. It should just depend on a layer, an abstraction layer. And that way, if program B decides at some point to change the underlying implementation, program A doesn't need to know about that, okay? That's why we have all these different parts of our application divided and organized in such a manner, okay? Now, in our own application, when you see, the reason why I've stored this way, it's because, you know, often when you use frameworks like Express or maybe some other web framework, and those frameworks tend to get popular, over a period of time, best practices also emerge, okay? So one of the best practices that emerged when people started making web applications is this concept called model view controller, okay? So a model is supposed to be a layer of your program that only deals with data, okay? It's responsible for talking to your database, let's put it that way. And then you have another part of your application that deals with incoming requests, and it needs to know how to handle those requests. Those are something that falls under routes, okay, and controllers. And in our program, in our case, we've actually written the controller and the route both in the same file, because it's a fairly small program. But in a larger program, you might not even write all this over here. You'll usually write even this in a separate file, and those files typically are called controllers. So they decide what needs to be done and how to handle each request, okay? And then we also have this view, and views deal with only that part of your application that is visible to a user, okay? What needs to be rendered in a web page, okay? So if you write your code in this way, it allows you to easily add more features as your program and your application evolves over time. So this is one of the many design frameworks or design patterns for implementing your code, right? There are several other patterns as well. If you are, let's say, working at the front end, specifically speaking, React.js is something that uses component-driven architecture. So each part of the user interface has its own view and has its own functionality, and those are usually clubbed together in the case of React, okay? Over here in backend systems, backend programming, you usually have MVC style of design pattern that is usually used, okay? I guess it's 8:10 over here, so we can stop right now. So I'm just going to quickly share this link. You can just go through it. It's actually from JavaScript in plain English itself. Lewis has an article where he's compared 3 different frameworks, Fastify, Express, and Bare Node.js. It's a really nice article, and I actually referred this article for this session. So you can just go over this, and you might want to revisit, the concepts of RESTful web services, and you might want to try to write the next program. So If you notice in our program, we've written some code that only displays all available rooms, right? But we also have one more function right below that says get rooms for user, okay, which takes in a user ID and it takes in a limit. So remember the last time we wrote the code for fetching all rooms for Elon, right? We had that code. I'm just going to open that over here, right? So all rooms from those clubs that a particular user follows. You can try to write that query if you understood this part. Now, in the next session, what I'm going to show you is I'm going to just talk a little more about how I structured this project, okay? Because I get the sense that it's important to cover that as well. If you're wondering how these folders I came about with, there is this something called Express App Generator, okay? So if you go to expressjs.com, you can check out in the Getting Started section, there is this option called Express Generator. So you can just install Express Generator, using npx install, and you can just follow this instruction. What this is going to do is it's going to create a folder, a directory structure with most of the folders that we saw here, and a lot of the boilerplate code will also be available for you, okay? But in this case, you don't need to do that because you're already using my boilerplate, but this is how I came about this project structure, okay? And you can also learn about best practices over here, okay? Some of these resources are over here, but I'll share the link with you. Hold on a second. I'm going to share the link of the article so that you can just take a look at that. I'll also share the link for Express Generator. So you can just try this out and see how it looks like. There will be slight differences between the directory that Express Generator gives you versus the one that we are using, because I've added some more additional code, right? Okay, and finally, you can go to medium.com/Egen, where I have described how you can write this program in node.js. So if some of these details are a little hazy for you, you can just scroll below right after the part where we've covered the database, and you should see somewhere over here. Yeah, building a web service. You can check this section out. It's gonna contain the code for you in case you have any trouble. Cool. So we'll cover the remaining APIs in the subsequent session, and then we'll also try to use these APIs in the client side so that we can actually see a list of rooms similar to how you see in the actual app. Okay. Cool. Thank you all, and have a wonderful weekend. And yes, please check this part, check this repository in the discussions tab for the homework that I will give you shortly in a few days. Yep. Bye.